Yesterday, I posted a video critique of Frank Turek, where he offered what I argued was an indoctrinational framework in responding to a question, one which undercut the ability of a Christian to think critically about and introspect their own beliefs, their own currently held beliefs, and to fairly evaluate new counter evidence to those beliefs. Somebody posted the following comment in response to the video. They said, if all that matters is that your children are saved and go to heaven, and why is indoctrination bad if it means your child is more likely to remain a Christian as an adult? Now, one person provided a reply to that comment, which I think is certainly a reasonable response, and it says, the ends do not justify the means. I think sometimes ends justify means, but it all is a question about when the ends justify the means. It's certainly not an absolute principle. And I think what we have here is a conflict of obligations, we can say. So let's consider another analogy. Let's say that you become pregnant or your spouse becomes pregnant, and both of you believe that any child that dies in utero automatically goes to heaven. Well, in this case, if your overriding concern is that your child has a 100% guarantee of ending up in heaven forever, that would of itself provide a warrant for you to abort your child in utero in order to ensure that your child goes to heaven. But this is what we would call a reductio ad absurdum, I think. I think we would recognize something has gone amiss in the reasoning here if you now have a warrant to kill your child in order to ensure they go to heaven. And if that doesn't trigger your spidey senses, then consider the same logic about a child, a neonate, like a newborn infant. Again, now we'd have a newborn infant who, presumably on this theology, is still existing before the age of accountability, and you'd have a moral warrant to kill an infant or perhaps a toddler in order to ensure they go to heaven. And I think clearly there is something deeply amiss in this kind of theology, and it certainly, I would submit, runs afoul of the principle the end does not always justify the means. And the reason is because I think we have different moral obligations. We have one moral obligation to do everything within reason to ensure that your child goes to heaven, perhaps, but you also have other obligations, such as not to kill children. And in this case, I would argue those obligations are the primary ones that trump the obligation to do everything possible to secure your child goes to heaven. And thus, we clearly do not have a warrant to kill children in order to ensure they go to heaven. Well, do we have a warrant to lie to children or to deceive children, to give them an indoctrinational education, or sorry, not an education, an indoctrinational intellectual formation to ensure that they, in fact, retain their beliefs? Um, and I would say again, it seems to me no. It seems to me that this is also a primary obligation we have to give our children not only what we believe are true beliefs, but also true intellectual virtues in order to think properly about beliefs. To malform a child's epistemic virtue is really equivalent to malforming their moral virtue. It would be wrong to make your child racist, for example, if that, for whatever reason, were to make it more likely that they would go to heaven. That would be a malformation of their moral virtue, which is fundamentally inconsistent with Christian formation. And it's the same with epistemic virtues and epistemic formation, that you don't make your child more like Christ if you make your child more irrational, fearful of others, unable to think critically. They're just fundamentally at odds with one another. And thus, I think it's a fundamental abdication of one's vocational calling as a parent to lie to their child, to deceive the child, to give the child an indoctrinational framework in order to undermine their ability to think critically about their beliefs and therefore ensure that they retain their beliefs over time. Now, another thing that I would note here that is worth keeping in mind as well is, first of all, we don't necessarily know that indoctrination is more likely in the long run to keep a child within the faith than not. I will say this, time and again, I have met atheists, the kind that identify themselves as new atheists, who talk and think about their beliefs with the same kind of approaches of categories that they, who once were fundamentalist Christians, thought about their beliefs. I've met so many new atheists who are essentially atheistic or secular fundamentalist Christians. They grew up in a fundamentalist Christian world. They were indoctrinated. They managed to break out of that belief system, but they retained their lack of epistemic virtue in the process and now apply that epistemic lack of virtue and the indoctrinational framework and the fundamentalist mindset that they were raised in to their new belief system as atheists, as naturalists, for example, as humanists, as secularists, as whatever else. And as a result, they are now again simply retaining those lack of virtues or those intellectual vices, and they are inured from being able to think critically about their beliefs as atheists. So, as a Christian, do you want to raise a child with a lack of epistemic virtue, a child who is locked in with epistemic vice and cannot think critically about their beliefs, who could lose their faith and then be unable to think critically about their loss of faith? I mean, there are so many implications here that it seems to me that it's just my simple answer would be yes, don't do it. Don't indoctrinate your children. Your call is to make your children seekers after truth, to make them lovers of knowledge and wisdom, whatever that ends up being. I remember, and I'll close maybe with this. Dallas Willard once said, if Jesus were not the truth, he would be the first person to tell you otherwise. Whether you're a Christian or not, I think you should vibe with and you should appreciate that commitment to truth, whatever the cost, including if that truth happens to be fundamentally at odds with what we currently believe. We should want to know that that is the case, and we should want our children to know if they are wrong as well.